Now, as the saying goes, America is the land of the free, the beacon of democracy where freedom is legally enshrined as constitutionally protected civil liberties for all citizens. Except it hasn't really been looking that way as of late. So let's review. There's a so-called trespassing bill, which now awaits President Obama's signature, that effectively serves as the nail in a coffin on the First Amendment. H.R. 347 criminalizes protest by making it a federal crime to disrupt, even by accident, any event attended by someone with Secret Service protection. There's, of course, the infamous National Defense Authorization Act, which would have faded into obscurity as another random funding bill, if not for a little provision that effectively destroyed due process in the United States. Thanks to the NDAA, the U.S. president now has the power to effectively kidnap any American anywhere in the United States and hold him or her in prison forever without trial. And speaking of due process, don't expect it if the government thinks you're a terrorist. On Monday, Attorney General Eric Holder explained when and how the U.S. government is allowed to kill its citizens in the endless war on terror. It is national security officials and not the courts who get to decide whether to send a deadly flying robot to vaporize you. The Hellfire missile ferry doesn't seem to have much time for due process, it seems. Well, it's a disturbing trend and a lot to discuss here, so let's turn to Reha Walla, the Advocacy Council for Human Rights First. Thank you so much for joining us on this program. Before we get into sort of these different legislative disturbing bills that we want to talk about, what is your overall sense in terms of where this administration has taken us as far as civil liberties are concerned, as far as constitutionally protected rights are concerned? Do you see these as sort of congressional pushes that don't necessarily say much about the Obama administration, or do you see this as a sign of perhaps something more dire?
I think it's interrelated. I mean, ultimately, the Obama administration needs to take responsibility for signing these legislative proposals into law or advancing certain theories regarding executive power and how it can be wielded in the war on terror. But certainly Congress has the brunt of the blame to take for some of these proposals and really pushing forward various measures that would, for example, codify indefinite detention or keep Guantanamo open. So there's plenty of blame to go around, but I think it's disappointing that the president and his administration hasn't been more forceful in leading in protecting civil liberties consistent with national security interests.
And how serious of a threat is this? I mean, it's easy to sort of say, oh, well, these are just different, disparate bills. They sound scary, but I'm sure it's not all that bad. I mean, should American citizens be concerned about their civil liberties in light of legislation like this?
Absolutely. For example, the NDAA that you mentioned codifies the authority of the military to indefinitely detain terrorism suspects without charge or trial. And that is one of the gravest threats to our liberty and security in the last decade. So I think certainly Americans should be concerned. And
they'll say, oh, terrorists are bad guys. I mean, how easy is it for the government, I guess, to confuse between who's a terrorist and who's just a protester or a regular citizen?
Well, that's exactly the point. The whole reason we have due process, court review criminal trials, where guilt has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, is to separate the true bad guys from those who may be innocent or who may have no intention to do us harm whatsoever. So there really isn't a tension between liberty and security. The reason that we have due process is to promote security of all individuals. And I think that for this reason, this erosion of rights is something we should all be concerned about.
And on the targeted assassinations issue, I know that your group had, when Eric Holder had announced that he was going to hold the speech, there was a press release saying that it's, you guys support the fact and applaud him for sort of giving this legal justification. Now that he's given it, what do you make of it? Are you happy with the reasoning that the Obama administration put out, or?
It just doesn't go far enough. That's the problem. We welcome the fact that the Obama administration is out there trying to provide some justification for its targeted killing policy, but really the American people don't know who is being killed in their name, and I think that's the big problem. What does it really mean to be an enemy combatant or a militant or someone that the United States government believes it can target for lethal force? And I think it's especially concerning that a lot of these targeted killings are happening away from the so-called hot battlefield in Afghanistan, in Yemen, or even in Somalia, which I think further calls into question what the government believes is its legal reasoning. And I think that's a concern that gets heightened in the case of constitutional considerations when you're talking about an American citizen.
Right, in the murky war on terror, I guess every place could potentially turn into a battlefield, unfortunately. H.R. 347, I don't know how familiar you are with this bill, but it's the so-called trespassing law that essentially criminalizes accidental disruptions of an event where a Secret Service person is at. Not as dire as indefinite detention or targeted assassination, but since it does raise this whole issue of the protest movement in the United States, I wonder if you see or perhaps fear a convergence of this war on terror sort of mixing with free speech and protest actions in America, since protests are heating up and don't seem to be stopping anytime soon, at least as far as Occupy Wall Street goes.
Right. Well, I'll be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with that particular bill, although I'm aware of it. But I do think that there's a overall, concern about counterterrorism, authorities expanding and reaching into traditional areas of civil liberties that we had not expected in the past. There are news stories of the New York Police Department surveilling Muslim communities, for example, as well. But I do think that the National Defense Authorization Act is really the kind of epitome of, where we are 10 years after 9/11, after Osama bin Laden, has been killed, with al-Qaeda on the ropes, as we're preparing to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think there's a real question about why we are in the business of further legislating against our civil liberties.
Well, fear drives a lot of this. And I guess my question to you is it too late? I mean, now that, the NDAA has passed, targeted assassinations now have legal justification, so that's okay. I mean, how do you go back? How do you undo these steps that sort of eroded our liberties?
Well, I think it's one step at a time, and I don't think it's too late. Most recently, the Obama administration, quite laudably, has passed regulations that seek to curtail some of the negative aspects of the NDAA. Those were released last week, so that will limit the cases in which mandatory military custody will be employed for terrorism suspects. And I think we have to push the administration to be more forthcoming about the legal reasons that are being advanced for targeted killing. Certainly on Guantanamo, it's disappointing that we're 3 years out from the administration's promise to close the facility, and not enough has been done. Over half of the detainees.
Nothing has been done. Essentially, they're frozen in place at this point.
That's right. I mean, many detainees have been transferred, but many are still there. Over half the existing population is cleared for release. Congressional restrictions have thus far prevented that from happening, but this administration has an opportunity to transfer some of those cleared detainees and make progress on its own stated policy goals.
Well, a lot of obligations, and I guess it remains to be seen whether that progress will actually take place. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. That was Raha Walla, Advocacy Council for Human Rights First.